will be considered the greatest pharaoh Egypt has ever known.
Egypt will stand against all the armies of the world.
They carved his face into stone, whispered his name in prayers, and bowed as if he held the sun itself. What could make a nation worship and then try to erase one man? This is the story of how his divinity became delusion, and how that delusion nearly tore Egypt apart. According to surviving evidence, many later Egyptians worked to erase or obscure his legacy, chiseling at both his monuments and his memory. But before the erasures and the downfall came the rise, years of carefully crafted worship that convinced not only his people, but the pharaoh himself that he was more than mortal. Picture a ruler whose every day began with reminders that he wasn't just powerful, he was touched by the divine. From the moment Akhenaten claimed the throne, visual and written messages began reinforcing the idea of his special connection to the Aten, the sun disk. Some surviving reliefs, for instance, show rays ending in hands that seem to bless him alone, which some scholars interpret as emphasizing a uniquely personal bond between king and god. Court hymns from the period sometimes go further, describing him not merely as a representative of the divine, but as central to it. Archaeological evidence shows that in certain temple complexes, earlier references to other gods were altered or replaced, including examples at Karnak, where Amun's imagery appears to have been reworked to feature Akhenaten. Some accounts from the period suggest there were ceremonial restrictions on how ordinary Egyptians could approach or view the pharaoh, with public appearances marked by elaborate staging that elevated his status above that of other mortals. By around the 5th year of his reign, accounts describe a noticeable shift in his public presentation. Some sources speak of ceremonial screens or coverings used during processions, framed as protecting others from his divine radiance. Foreign correspondences from the Amarna letters hint at unusual court etiquette, including long silences before responding to envoys, something that may have been interpreted as a sign of superiority. Recorded tributes from Nubian officials are sometimes phrased in ways that present them not as political necessity, but as voluntary offerings acknowledging divine favor. Egyptian royal theology had always tied the pharaoh to Horus, but Akhenaten projected this relationship further. Inscriptions on boundary stelae for the new capital at Amarna state that the city existed because of the will of both Aten and the king. Some traditional hymns were adapted, shifting praise for the sun's daily rise to credit the pharaoh's agency in maintaining cosmic order, a symbolic elevation of his personal role. The Hebsed festival, ordinarily reinforcing a ruler's duty to the land and people, became in his reign a ceremony heavily centered on Aten's rays bestowing authority directly. When religious officials voiced opposition, there is evidence of temple alterations and dismantling in Thebes, moves many interpret as deliberate sidelining of rival cults. Later legal and administrative texts from Amarna contain formulae placing Aten and the king side by side in divine statements. While some readings suggest an attempt to equate them, the extent of this self-identification remains debated among historians. Still, these gradual shifts mark the start of something larger. Those subtle and not so subtle changes were the first cracks. What came next would strike at the heart of Egypt's sacred order. Even in ancient Egypt, rulers were bound by traditions meant to preserve Ma'at, the sacred balance between gods, people, and the land. Breaking those expectations was risky. Akhenaten's first major rupture came when he began promoting the Aten at the expense of Amun's powerful cult, taking steps that sharply reduced Amun's public presence. At Karnak, inscriptions bearing Amun's name were chiseled away, replaced with imagery tied to Aten. This went beyond theological debate. Certain inscriptions that referred to gods in the plural were altered to singular form, reinforcing the Aten's central place. At Dendera, some depictions associated with other deities, such as Hathor, were reworked to reflect royal and Aten imagery. The message was becoming clear. All divine attention should be directed toward one figure and one god. For centuries, priests had served as intermediaries between the people and Egypt's vast pantheon. Now, many found themselves sidelined. Some surviving records suggest religious officials in Thebes attempted to secure sacred texts and objects before inspectors arrived. In other places, relics tied to older cults quietly disappeared from public view. Adding to the tension, there are accounts from the period that describe harsher treatment for those who continued to honor banned deities, though the exact penalties remain debated by historians. What is clear is that the atmosphere quickly shifted. Ordinary Egyptians adapted in small, cautious ways, altering prayers, avoiding traditional shrines, and keeping amulets hidden. One incident often associated with growing unrest took place during an unusual Nile flood cycle. The river did not rise when expected, disrupting agriculture. Akhenaten declined to perform the long-standing rituals to Hapi, the flood god, instead publicly asserting that the waters would respond to Aten's will through him. When the flooding patterns changed erratically, coinciding with damage to crops, some contemporaries blamed religious neglect, while the king accused disloyal priests of bringing harm to the land. By around his 9th year as ruler, the scope of these changes expanded. The language of official inscriptions continued to erase plural references to gods, and alterations spread to monuments and tomb inscriptions from earlier dynasties. Even damage from natural events, like the earthquake that shook parts of Luxor, was interpreted by the king's circle as proof of other gods' weakness. Proof, in their view, that further construction should honor Aten and Akhenaten himself. Some officials from the period note alterations to dating formulas and titulary, shifting them away from long-standing religious frameworks. For traditionalists, this was another sign that the old order was being dismantled piece by piece, and these were only the opening moves. Far bigger changes to Egypt's divine world were still to come. Ancient Egyptians honored hundreds, possibly more, deities overseeing everything from the floodwaters of the Nile to childbirth. During Akhenaten's reign, evidence from temple alterations and his new capital suggests a sharp and deliberate shift that sidelined nearly all of them in favor of the Aten. Amun, the king of gods, was among the first to lose prominence, with his name hacked out of inscriptions so forcefully that the damage is still visible today. Other long-standing cults, from Hathor to Thoth, saw their temples closed or repurposed. Even protective household figures, once a familiar sight in homes, largely disappeared from sanctioned art and ritual objects. Material remains hint at active suppression. At Amarna, fragments from statues of other gods were incorporated into new construction, their sacred forms reduced to building filler. Archaeologists have also found deposits of broken figurines that once depicted afterlife deities, which in some cases were reworked to show Akhenaten himself, suggesting an intentional redirection of spiritual focus toward the king. Surviving texts and imagery from the period uphold this theology. Aten as the singular eternal source of all life, with no divine equals. The so-called Great Hymn to the Aten presents creation as the work of Aten alone, without the counsel of other gods that earlier traditions described. The impact on daily life was tangible. Some festivals tied to local gods vanished from the public calendar. Traditional prayers invoking multiple deities fell out of official use, and certain religious symbols stopped appearing in burial goods. One surviving divorce document from Memphis even records a man linking his domestic troubles to the prohibition on venerating Ptah, a reminder of how deeply belief shaped personal affairs. Farmers, meanwhile, lost access to religious calendars once tied to the lunar cycles of Thoth, leaving planting schedules more vulnerable to guesswork. By around year 12 of his reign, records and archaeological surveys point to a major contraction in temple activity. Many priests left their posts or adapted to serving in Atenas contexts, while major pilgrimage centers, such as those dedicated to Osiris, saw dramatic declines in attendance. Administrative changes reached into language itself. Inscriptions avoiding the term goddess appear from this period, with scribes using longer descriptive phrases instead. Akhenaten's religious program was not just about removing rival gods. It concentrated authority, spiritual, political, and economic, into a tighter circle centered on the throne. This inevitably meant that institutions built on the old order and the people who ran them were vulnerable. Those who had once stood at the heart of Egypt's sacred life were about to discover how quickly their status could change under the new regime. The priests of Egypt weren't just spiritual leaders, they were among the most powerful elites in the kingdom. Their temples controlled land, wealth, and resources, and their council often guided royal decisions. Under Akhenaten, their position began to erode. Records from his reign indicate significant changes to temple economics, with resources once tied to major cults increasingly redirected toward royal initiatives or newly founded Aten shrines. Some evidence points to audits and the removal of certain officials for alleged mismanagement, though how systematic these measures were remains debated. What's clear is that these shifts unsettled an institution that had stood for centuries. Replacements in key religious posts followed. In prominent cities, experienced high priests were swapped out for figures with little or no theological training, sometimes individuals with backgrounds in the military or the royal household. In other cases, those once in charge of venerable cult centers were reassigned to remote outposts devoted to Aten. Imagine a priest accustomed to Thebes' grand processions suddenly sent to a barren settlement, cut off from family, and stripped of sacred texts. Surviving examples of personal writings from the era suggest that such reassignments caused hardship, with appeals for support made to relatives or former colleagues. Archaeological and textual fragments suggest this was accompanied by various forms of pressure. Reported types of repression included public removal from office, reassignment to menial duties, confinement, and in some accounts, execution. The reliability of specific stories varies. Some describe processions designed to humiliate displaced priests, and others refer to ceremonial roles being inverted as a form of shaming. Whatever the precise details, the cumulative effect was to weaken the influence of the old priesthood and discourage open resistance. The fate of those who resisted outright is still pieced together from scattered evidence. Some remains found in contexts linked to temple demolitions or repurposed building materials have been interpreted as belonging to former clergy, though this is controversial. Later sources allege that certain festival traditions were subverted to spotlight Aten and diminish other gods' cults, underlining the symbolic nature of the struggle. While it's hard to measure how widespread or coordinated such acts were, they formed part of a broader atmosphere in which the old religious order was being actively dismantled. By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, the priesthood's role had shifted from guardians of an enduring tradition to functionaries in a state-centered cult. Their reduced status wasn't just about lost power, it meant the gradual loss of ritual knowledge and experience that had been passed down for generations. This narrowing of Egypt's spiritual leadership paved the way for the next stage of Akhenaten's agenda, one that reached beyond institutions and into the very memory of the culture itself. Akhenaten's reforms didn't just target the living, they reached backward, reshaping how the past was remembered and how traditions were carried forward. For a culture built on continuity, such changes cut deep. Some sources suggest he introduced ritual reforms that altered or replaced older practices that had been followed for centuries. Take the opening of the mouth ceremony. For generations, priests used special tools to symbolically awaken mummies for the afterlife. In some Atenist contexts, this rite appears to have been reduced or replaced with versions centered solely on the king and the Aten. Archaeologists have uncovered buried caches of these older tools near Thebes, likely hidden by people determined to keep them safe. Other long-held royal traditions shifted as well. The Sed festival, traditionally a rare jubilee to renew a pharaoh's vitality, was staged during Akhenaten's reign with notable differences. Depictions from his time show him largely stationary, shaded by attendants, while proclamations of his eternal youth replace the physical endurance elements seen in earlier periods. To some observers, this signaled a symbolic turning inward, making the festival less about demonstrating service to the land and more about exalting the ruler himself. Funerary beliefs also underwent change. In certain Atenist burials, passages linked to Osiris and the underworld were replaced with texts focusing on unity with Aten's light. The extent to which older versions of the Book of the Dead were banned is debated, but hidden caches of scrolls and fragments suggest that some people risked punishment to preserve them. In these cases, the challenge was not only theological, it was deeply personal, affecting how individuals hope to navigate the journey after death. Many everyday rituals that once marked the rhythm of life became harder to practice openly. Festivals tied to seasons and the Nile cycles gave way to celebrations of Aten, and offerings to older deities became dangerous to perform in public. The disruption was felt in practical ways. Without seasonal rites, farmers lost familiar markers that had guided planting and harvesting for generations. Yet the traditions did not vanish. Archaeological finds, such as modest household shrines hidden behind walls, graffiti invoking old gods and plastered over corners, and reused furniture carved with discrete older symbols suggest that private devotion continued despite official disapproval. In some temples, restorers painted traditional deities beneath fresh Atenist scenes, knowing the facades could be stripped away later. Such acts of quiet defiance showed that even under tight control, belief had its underground channels. But resistance, however subtle, did not go unnoticed forever. Within the royal court, suspicion began to grow, not just toward nameless dissenters in the population, but toward those standing closest to the throne. Inside the palace, the king's tightening grip began to reach the highest ranks of his own circle. Records from the time suggest the disappearance or quiet removal of several high officials and even family members, though the reasons remain uncertain. One oft-discussed case is that of the Vizier Ramos, a prominent figure early in Akhenaten's reign. Later building work in his former office revealed his personal seal buried beneath new flooring, a small but curious detail that some historians see as symbolic erasure. Even the royal household was not immune to such changes. Surviving correspondence hints at tension between Akhenaten and his mother, Queen Tia, possibly over the economic impact of his religious reforms. Some sources suggest she spent her later years under close watch in a residence far from the political centers. Archaeological evidence from her burial, a modest, unfinished chamber, has prompted debate over whether her declining status was political, personal, or the result of unrelated circumstances. There are also burial anomalies from this period that may point to political or personal fallout within the palace. Some graves near Amarna are anonymous and hastily prepared, their occupants lacking names or conventional inscriptions. One example included an amulet depicting a deity no longer officially sanctioned, raising questions about whether possession of forbidden religious items played a role in their fate. The identities and causes, however, remain unconfirmed. Smenkhare, sometimes described as Akhenaten's co-regent, is another mystery. His brief tenure and the later reduction of his name from certain monuments have long been debated. An inventory from the palace during that period records the sudden reassignment of his attendants, but whether this reflects a political split, illness, or something more deliberate is unknown. The defaced face on a coffin attributed to him seems to signal posthumous disfavor, but scholars differ on the interpretation. Military leadership also saw upheaval. A surviving orders tablet indicates that Commander Horemheb was reassigned from major campaigns to remote desert posts after voicing concerns over troop funding. While this may have been a test of loyalty, sidelining a trusted general at a time of unrest would have long-term consequences. The administrative apparatus came under scrutiny as well. Broken and incomplete tablets have been found at Amarna's record-keeping sites, suggesting efforts to control or rewrite the official account of events. Whether these were targeted destructions or simply the result of abandonment is still debated, but the loss of records adds to the opacity of this era. By the final years of his reign, the court was dominated by loyalists who either embraced or performed unwavering devotion to the Aten and the king. That atmosphere of guarded loyalty would shape his next great challenge, a crisis far beyond the palace walls where daily survival was beginning to outweigh devotion. The Nile's floods grew erratic during the later years of Akhenaten's reign, leaving farmland cracked and harvests thin. Yet the scale of construction in his new city barely slowed. While granaries emptied, workers still dragged massive stone blocks into place for towering statues sheathed in gold leaf. Treasury accounts from this time show investment in luxury items, precious stones, fine metals, continuing alongside a decline in staple reserves. Tax demands also shifted. Surviving economic documents from the period reflect heavier levies on rural producers, not only in grain and livestock, but sometimes in raw materials with no link to survival: pigments, exotic woods, and decorative goods destined for royal projects. Villages that once fed temple storehouses now saw food diverted to support Atenist building programs. Human remains from worker communities near Amarna bear signs of malnutrition, hinting at the impact of these shortages beyond the palace walls. In a break from long-standing custom, Akhenaten framed the hardship as a test from Aten, not a crisis needing ritual intervention. Traditional ceremonies to honor Hapi, the god of the flood, were absent. Instead, resources went into monumental carvings and more gilded images of the pharaoh himself. Skilled labor that might have shored up irrigation channels was assigned to these commissions, further straining agricultural recovery. Foreign envoys at the time remarked on the striking brilliance of Amarna's monuments against the backdrop of evident scarcity in the countryside. Art and inscriptions start reflecting this tension. Some tomb scenes depict weary laborers in direct contrast to the idealized figures of prior reigns. In certain private burials, archaeologists have uncovered small objects and amulets linked to deities outside the Atenist pantheon, suggesting acts of personal devotion carried out quietly despite official prohibitions. These finds indicate that, for some, the need for spiritual protection, especially in hard times, outweighed the risks of defying state religion. There is also material evidence that food security broke down to the point where sacred boundaries were crossed. Bone deposits from Amarna include remains from temple livestock in contexts more consistent with consumption than ritual sacrifice. Such finds point to a population willing to risk religious violation simply to eat. Even within the workshop serving the Atenist program, hints of dissent appeared. Some decorative details and surviving wall fragments have been interpreted as subtle references to banned symbols or deities, possibly included by artisans as quiet commentary on the times. Whether these choices were deliberate or accidental is debated, but they suggest a disconnect between the official message and private sentiment. Starvation changed what people were willing to risk, and that pressure was beginning to pull apart the system that had sustained Akhenaten's power. Akhenaten's hold on power began to unravel quickly, and not only at the edges. The first signs were visible in Amarna itself, where surviving payroll records show entire work crews vanishing from the rolls. Whether they fled to their home villages or were reassigned is unknown, but their absence left construction sites silent. The appetite for building monuments in the midst of scarcity had faded. The military situation soon shifted as well. General Horemheb, once pushed into a distant command, reemerges in the historical record late in or shortly after Akhenaten's reign as a significant political figure. Accounts from the period suggest that royal authority was weakening, and the collapse of central control allowed military and court officials to gain ground. A restructured army, stripped of long-standing symbols and supplied unevenly, had little reason to keep the old loyalties. Widespread illness then swept through the population. Sources from the time note a disease outbreak, likely worsened by malnutrition, that reached deep into the cities. Some accounts describe physicians quietly turning to older banned rituals in their treatments. These deviations from the Atenist program seem to have been tolerated, indicating that practical needs were overtaking strict enforcement. Instability also reached the royal household. Artistic and administrative records show Nefertiti's position changing. She appears in later depictions without the emblematic rays of a 10 and is linked with residences away from the ceremonial heart of the city. Their daughter Meritaten is recorded using titles typically reserved for a chief queen. Such shifts point to political recalibration within the palace. Other family members, including the young Tutankhaten, were drawn into new alliances, possibly as part of an effort to manage succession. The structure Akhenaten had built depended on constant affirmation of his religious vision. When economic pressures deepened and traditional networks ceased to function, the system had no reserve of goodwill or stability to fall back on. A mix of political vulnerability, religious alienation, economic strain, and military disengagement left his position untenable. The circumstances of Akhenaten's death remain unknown. What is clear is that his successors acted quickly afterward, ending Aten-only worship, reinstating traditional cults, and reallocating resources back to established religious centers. Inscriptions from the following years record the dismantling of his city's temples and the reuse of their stone in other projects, physical evidence of a systematic rollback. In trying to overwrite Egypt's past, Akhenaten left behind traces that allowed later rulers to reverse his course with speed and force. What followed was not only a political transition, but a deliberate effort to strip his reign from official memory, a campaign whose scale still shapes how we see him today. Akhenaten's successors embarked on an unusually thorough campaign to erase Atenist names and images from public monuments. This went far beyond touching up inscriptions. Stones from his temples were dismantled and reused in other projects, and his purpose-built capital at Amarna was abandoned so completely that, within a generation, drifting sand had buried entire districts. Many of his statues were deliberately attacked, often in a set order. The A10 hieroglyph removed from his crown, then the face-to-face then the royal cartouche damaged. This looks less like random vandalism and more like a methodical effort to strip away his identity. The destruction at key sites suggests a clear intent. At Karnak, some carved blocks with his image were removed entirely and turned inward so the decoration faced the wall. On the Abydos king list, there are gaps where certain reigns, including his, should appear, which some historians read as deliberate omissions. Even in private tombs built during his rule, Atenist imagery was often painted over with older, traditional gods after his death. For a culture that usually prized preserving the record, this was a major break in practice. Surviving budget notations refer to corrections of inscriptions, a polite term for chiseling them out. One piece of workman's graffiti from Deir el Medina boasts about extra pay for removing his name from a monument, suggesting this erasure was treated like any other skilled commission. Ironically, attempts to erase him have helped modern researchers recognize him. Aggressive removal can leave strange gaps and mismatched stonework, a blank space on a king list, a reused block with traces of earlier carving that point back to what was removed. In Luxor, some walls show noticeably deeper recuts where larger hieroglyphs, later linked to Akhenaten's titles, once stood. Recent analyses have added to the picture. Imaging techniques have revealed faint painted outlines beneath later plaster, including phrases invoking the Aten. Some researchers think certain items, like high-quality burial goods later used for Tutankhamun, may have been repurposed from the Amarna period. Such clues help piece together how material from his reign was redistributed and disguised. Amarna itself holds more personal evidence. Excavations of refuse pits have turned up broken amulets, small shrines, and texts referring to the Aten, kept not necessarily out of devotion, but possibly as remnants too valuable, sentimental, or risky to destroy outright. One fragment of papyrus from a later context carries a short line paraphrased as, "If asked, I never knew him," a neat summary of the caution that followed. By the time this work was done, Akhenaten had been transformed in the record from a living ruler into little more than an absence. The visible traces that remain, gaps, defacements, reused stone, tell a story of concentrated power, sudden collapse, and the dangers of overreaching. It is here, in the empty spaces he left behind, that the next and most enduring lesson of his reign comes into focus. Power doesn't corrupt, it exposes. Akhenaten's reign shows how concentrated authority tied to a single religious vision can destabilize a state. His sweeping religious changes alienated key institutions. His building projects drained resources during scarcity, and his isolation from political allies left him vulnerable when support collapsed. In the end, his experiment failed, and later, Egyptians took deliberate steps to make sure it couldn't be repeated. Which decision do you think doomed him most? Religious reform, economic drain, or palace purges? Tell us in the comments, and if you enjoyed this historical true crime, hit like or subscribe for more strange episodes from the past.